All right, hello everyone. I welcome all of you to today's webinar of the Gerhard Center. Gerhard Center has been doing many webinars during this year, and this webinar series is entitled "The Aftermath of the COVID-19: The New Social Impact Ecosystem." As you can see, the topic is extremely important because we do have an existing system that needs to change significantly because it's leaving behind a lot of poor people. So we definitely need a new one. It gives me a great pleasure to be moderating this particular session because of the importance of the topic, and I really thank my friend and colleague Dr. Ali Aouni for inviting me to moderate. Today's topic is universal basic income. There's a lot of talk about universal basic income following COVID-19. And for some people, it might look like it's something new that hasn't existed before. Reality is, it has existed a very, very long time ago. The basic definition of the universal basic income is that it consists of a periodic cash allowance given to all citizens to provide them with a standard of living above poverty line. The core, the base of the message is this. And it goes back actually it goes way back to Thomas Paine back in 1797. So we are talking about something that's very old, that has existed then and continued to exist in different versions and in different countries. It was applied in Kenya, Finland, Namibia, India, and Canada. It even existed in the United States in the second half of the 20th century during the time of Martin Luther King. And then after that, it sort of disappeared or it was hidden in a way, all right? And then it re-emerged again, okay? As it operated or as it exists in different versions in different areas of the world and through history, it always kept its common features, okay? That it's universal, it's unconditional, it's individual, it's regular, and it's a cash payment. Okay? All of these features continue to exist even though it took different shapes. As we face COVID-19 and the horrible impact, particularly on the poor, okay? The re-emergence, let's say, of the universal basic income comes as coming to the rescue. And the question is it really the solution? Can it be applied? Is this utopian scenario of not having anyone being poor basically possible? Okay? We are very, very lucky today to have with us the expert on the field, for sure. She actually wrote a book on it, and the title of the book is The Case for Universal Basic Income. So we're in court, and this is the lawyer defending the basic income, and she has the argument that supports it. It's my big pleasure to welcome Professor Louise Haagh. Professor Louise has a very, very impressive CV. She's a professor of politics at the University of York. She's a chair emeritus of the Basic Income Earth Network, patron of the Citizens Income Trust of the UK, and an expert under the SAGE group set down to provide input into the European Health Equity Status Report initiative of the World Health Organization. Professor Haagh has acted as an expert to a range of governments and international institutions on economic security, including the Council of Europe, the Organization of American States, and the World Bank in Latin America and Asia. So she's been all over the world. She has the case for the universal basic income. And without any further ado, and I asked Professor Haagh to start her presentation, and we're all looking forward to knowing and understanding more the universal basic income and supporting the case.
Well, thank you very much for this warm welcome, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this prestigious webinar at this exciting time in the pandemic, where we're beginning to look to the future and at lessons that we can learn. So today I'm going to talk about the case that I make for basic income in my book, but I'm also going to put that in the context of the wider debate and changes in society, to which the book also responds. And I'm going to argue, as I do in my book, that basic income is necessary as a stable structure in society. Basic income, as was mentioned, has been around for a very long time as an idea. And as such, it has a number of elements. However, never have all of the elements been implemented together. So we've had versions of UBI, debates about UBI, but we've never seen a full UBI being implemented. And I'm going to talk about why that is in a moment. So my aim today in the talk is to talk a little bit about the current juncture where we are today, why basic income has become so high on the public and global agenda, which for those of us who have been involved in the debate about basic income for decades is really a very exciting time. I'm going to talk about the case that I make for universal basic income and how that is slightly different to some other cases that have been made, not in contradiction, but slightly different, and why I think that the case I make fits the current challenges. And essentially, to put it simply, I see basic income as an institutional innovation. And it speaks to many different applications, whether we're talking about building a democratic society, or whether we're talking about poverty alleviation, or we're talking about putting a human face to globalization. I think in all of these senses and wherever you stand, the case can be made that basic income is an institutional innovation that is long overdue. So I said before that universal basic income, defined by all of its features, has never been implemented as such. So let's go back to Paine, that was mentioned. And when Paine made a case for citizens' dividends in the 1790s, he was reacting to the high levels of inequality in his time and to the extension and privatization of property, and in particular the encroachment on common lands that was occurring in England at that time. And he argued that it was fundamentally unjust that individuals would no longer have access to the common heritage of the earth and the land. And in compensation, every individual should be given a means of subsistence that would be unconditional and dignified. And really, that claim, that argument has been central to the case for basic income ever since. And it's quite right, as was mentioned at the beginning, that this case has waxed and waned. It's appeared now and again, and people talk about waves of basic income advocacy and talk about those waves typically coinciding with major crises, when the fact that we have never implemented a fully universal inclusion structure in the modern society comes to the fore. And of course, COVID-19 is such a moment when we realize that even despite the best efforts of governments in spending so much money, it's unable to reach everyone adequately. And so the case really is that in order to reach people adequately when we face crises, we need to have something in place, an infrastructure that not only serves us from day to day, but that can also serve us and be extended in times of crisis. So the universal basic income has standardly, as we standardly defined it, 5 features. So it's universal. It's given to every individual in society. Now, we might say, well, we have already in many of the most mature welfare states in Europe, something similar to this, that we have the notional right of every person, should they fall short or should they enter poverty, to receive assistance. But universal basic income is slightly different. The idea behind universal basic income is that people receive a small grant, a subsistence grant, throughout their life, and they receive it even when they don't necessarily need it. Or of course, that is what has caused so much controversy. The closest we perhaps have come to something like that is the Alaska Dividend Fund, which is a fund that distributes a dividend to every Alaskan person every year. But of course, the dividend varies and doesn't necessarily cover people's needs, but it is certainly a shared right in a form of heritage. And in that sense, it does mimic some of the intentions of universal basic income. And the other features, which I've already highlighted, are that it's permanent, it is periodic, it's paid every month, not as in Alaska every year. It's unconditional, which is again is a feature that is completely unknown also in the most developed welfare states, in that you do not have to prove how much you own, how much you earn, who you live with. You have to be a permanent resident usually, but that is the only condition. And it's given to individuals irrespective of their partner's income. So in the contemporary period, let's say if we go back to the 1970s, you saw a revival of the case for universal basic income in the 1970s, and some experiments in the United States and Canada in aspects of basic income, specifically the unconditionality element, where in Canada they had some means-tested grants that were given unconditionally. And I'll talk about some of the evidence from that experiment in a moment, which has come to light more recently. Whereas in the global south, the discussion about UBI really got going in the context of the extension of conditional cash transfers. It began in the 80s and then were extended in the 90s. Next slide, please. So it's worth mentioning that in this contemporary period, you have a number of different thinkers advocating for basic income for different reasons. And they don't necessarily entirely agree on the reasons, but they do agree on the case overall. And so you have Milton Friedman, whose argument in the 1970s for a negative income tax, which is a version of basic income, rested on an idea to simplify the welfare state. You had the case by left libertarians that is very famous, and perhaps the most famous case, Philippe Van Parijs specifically, that was very differently premised in an idea to expand choice and leisure and alternative work and lifestyles. But then, and I draw a line there on the slide, you have a very different scenario emerging with global economic restructuring. I'm talking about neoliberalism, and which generates new forms of insecurity, new forms of precarity in the economy, a rise in inequality and poverty. And you have guys standing, advocating for a new form of economic security that will be more effective for the poor. You have Carl Widerquist arguing for the right to exit as a complement to the right to work. If you haven't got the right not to work, exit a job or take another one with security, you actually don't have the right to work. And so you don't have freedom in the market. It's a very powerful argument. And you have my case for basic income, which is more in the vein of a right to human development and as a way of democratizing the state and the use of public finances. And I see basic income as part of a basket of measures. So the question is, if we have so many different ideas about basic income, does that make the case weaker or stronger? Well, my argument, I've just written a piece with some colleagues in the UNDP, is that actually reality has pressed the case, not ideology. And that is a unifying force in the sense that we really cannot have functioning societies or economies without ensuring the individuals in society. And we can't afford to do that just when individuals enter crises, because of a number of hazards, moral hazards linked with that, which I'm happy to talk about if anyone want me to. So global economic restructuring generated a misfit, really, between the reality of the economy and the welfare states that were built in the post-war period. And what you see here in this slide is a falling wage share in GDP across the world. And you see it in the United States very starkly, beginning in the 1960s, and then the share of wages in the economy just continue to fall and have continued to fall at a much more rapid rate in the last 2 decades. That's very notable. And you see the same trend in advanced economies as well as in the global south. Next slide, please. You also have seen in the same period, although this is a static picture of the 2010s, you've seen a rise in precarious work. Part of the drivers for the falling wage share is the globalization of the economy and the way in which the global economy is driven by the search for low-skilled labor around the world. And therefore, you have local economies being destabilized. Not only do you have the large informal sector, which existed before, but you also have a break on the modernization project of the post-war era, in which there was a sort of sense of a move towards full employment, and you move instead towards a precarious wage economy. So these are big global forces that generate the gap that people like Guy Standing, myself, and others have argued need to be filled somehow for the economies to function. Next slide, please. So the question is, why now? Since we've seen the falling wage share happening, so to speak, for the last 2 decades or even further back, why is it that we're seeing the case for universal basic income emerging now? And I think there's a number of reasons for that, but one of the reasons, I think, is austerity in Europe. I think austerity in Europe really brought some of the trends that we know from the global south to the heart of the global north. And there was a sense of insecurity that couldn't be met by the existing welfare state structures emerging. And you had a discussion sort of bumbling up really within the European Union in different countries. So what you see here is the European Social Survey featuring a question about universal basic income in 2016, which I think indicates just how mainstream the debate about universal basic income began to be, but by the sort of mid-2010s. And you also see here, although there's varying levels of support, the average levels of support in Europe, even then, at the beginning of the topic being known more widely, was around 50%. So quite a high level of support for an idea that many people consider to be radical. Next slide, please. And so if we look at what is the rationale and how can we see a rationale in the global north and south, given that the conditions are very different in the global north and south, sort of coming together, as it were. Well, in the global north, as I said, you begin to see the dysfunction, the missing pieces in the post-war welfare state, which can be linked with the character of means-tested support and the poverty traps that's now recognized to generate. In other words, if someone ends up on basic income assistance, they're not allowed to work. And because work has become precarious, people are then resistant to join the precarious labor market, which creates a sort of moral hazard. Whereas if you imagine you had a universal basic income that allows you to earn on top of the grants that you receive, you can see that that's both more secure for individuals, but also generates an actual scope for flexibility, both for individuals and the economy. So the misfit in the design in the post-war welfare state that's generated by the lack of some kind of continuous security safety net at the bottom of the welfare state that begins to show. And in the global south, the evidence of conditional cash transfers, which is the anti-poverty initiative that emerges in response to neoliberal globalization, that's also beginning to be recognized as flawed. That the time limits on the grants that people receive generates as many problems as poverty itself. It generates more insecurity and has adverse motivational health impacts. And people begin to argue, therefore, for extending those conditional cash transfers that were initially very heavily targeted to wider populations. And so both in North and South, there's growing evidence of negative impacts of the current design of income assistance. And it's just worth briefly going over the rise of conditional cash transfers and what they were about. And so, as I already explained, there was a new anti-poverty approach that took hold in the 1990s. As a paradigm for development. And one of the problems with it is that it actually replaces some of the industrialization strategies that have predominated in the post-war period. And many see that the new anti-poverty paradigm is too limited because it is too singular. And you see then an emergence of an approach that's called targeting, which is whereby public funds are dedicated to the very poorest in society, the extreme poor, and at the administrative apparatus of the state is reappointed to identify the most needy in society. The problem with this is that this itself doesn't actually cover the need that has emerged. So the misfit that I talked about before begins to be apparent. The other issue that is very evident in driving this targeting is something that's also a problem for universal basic income, which I'll come to in a moment, which is that there's very low levels of tax in GDP in many countries of the global south. In Latin America, the average level of tax GDP is 18%, very far, half of what you require to actually implement a full UBI along with social services. And so this really generates attention. Not only does it create a design of anti-poverty policy that is overly targeted, but also makes a transition out of that approach quite difficult. Next slide, please. And so, just to summarize some of the inadequacy of the conditional cash transfers that has made the case for universal basic income in the global south and has moved it up the policy agenda very gradually since the case was first made in the mid-1990s. And you see the most well-known models of conditional cash transfer emerging in Brazil and Mexico were focused on the poorest in society and obviously in providing cash. And they set the trend for the adoption as a paradigm, the CCTS as a paradigm by the global development institutions. And what's significant about this, and it has to be said it's a very positive trend, is that this is the first time that poverty is a systemic administrative concern for the state in the global south. So the emergence of cash transfers was a positive development in that sense. And it gradually comes to dominate policy and social spending in a number of countries, such as, for example, Brazil, where 25% of the population at any one time are covered by cash transfers. So it may be that individual families are transitioning in and out of cash transfers, but actually a quarter of the population are covered by those transfers, which is not dissimilar to what we see in the global north. However, there are problems, as I said before, in the design of conditional cash transfers because there has to be this effort in identifying the most needy, but you don't have adequate records. There's then a supplement of extensive measurement criteria that sometimes aren't actually as accurate as people might think. So anything from whether you have livestock, whether you have a fan, whether you have cemented floor, whether you have a television, and things like that. And it becomes really morally hazardous to try and identify who's deserving in this context. Also because incomes are very fluctuating in households, and really the determination of who is eligible and who isn't is very hard. And so there's stigma, and I dare say the scope for corruption. I'm not suggesting there is corruption in every case, but there's scope for it. And I think there is a social uncertainty about entitlements. And there's also adverse health effects of unstable grants that have been identified by the Economic Commission for Latin America. Published a report in 2012, which was very extensive in its documentation. And in a recent report that I did for the World Health Organization, we are reiterating some of that evidence and adding some new evidence to that. And you also have a very interesting phenomenon, which is where you target vulnerable groups. Counterintuitively, you can have adverse effects from doing that. And one of the very sad examples of that was found in the disability grant in South Africa, whereby in order to be eligible to receive income support amongst the very poor, you had to display symptoms of AIDS. In other words, people stopped taking their medicines in order to gain access to income support. And so, of course, that's obviously a tragic unintended effect, but it does show the difficulty with targeting resources on crises because people will put them, people might put themselves in crisis in order to actually access the resources, but also you miss the element of prevention, which is very important in anti-poverty policy, and the element of motivation, which we think is associated with paying cash grants regularly to people. So design really of income security is key to many of the debates about CCTs, which have made the case for basic income in the global South. Next slide, please. And here I have a large picture of Eduardo Suplicy, who was the first senator elected to the Workers' Party, to the Senate in Brazil. He was elected in 1988. And he was an advocate, probably one of the first, for extending conditional cash transfers in Brazil from a targeted form to a universal form. And he was responsible for putting that into law, so that in Brazil you now have a law that states that Brazil should introduce universal basic income when society can afford it. And he has made the case that UBI is necessary as a response to the erosion of security through labor markets, which I've already mentioned, and also necessary to rectify the mistakes that are linked with conditional cash transfers in order to favor unconditional and possibly a universal model. But first of all, unconditional, and then gradually a universal model of income security. And the argument is that UBI is the next, towards the next step in the move towards making income security citizens' rights, is to make cash grants unconditional, and finally a statutory entitlement. And if you look at the argument, I just reproduce here the argument of Guy Standing, who also makes this case, and he made it very well in an article in Basic Income Studies in 2008. He talks about the ubiquity of insecurity in modern society. So we're not just talking about big events like epidemics that put citizens at risk, although this is of course important. But we're also talking about what he calls hazards, which are normal life events that if not covered, trigger crises. So the illness, divorce, family breakup, unemployment, for which there is necessarily a rapid response. And that can actually have very long-term effects that then become costly both for the individuals and society. And then he talks about uncertainty, which is more linked with economic factors, not so much personal factors, that can also affect individuals. And then when these conditions interact, you have then chronic insecurity in society, which is unproductive social state for the economy, for individuals to be in, and it may be out of sight. But chronic insecurity prevents the economy from functioning to full capacity. Next page, please. And then you come to my book. So whilst I agree with the case for economic security, and UBI can be seen as a sort of safety net in the big global market, I think the case for universal basic income is more than just a compensation or more than a basic safety net. I think it needs to be seen in the context of constituting health. And also, I think when we look at the design of UBI and all of the things that I've already mentioned, we need to understand how making the case for universal basic income also transforms the way we understand work and motivation. Now, this goes quite deep into the heart of neoclassical theory, which assumes a leisure work trade-off, that is, that individuals must be insecure or fundamentally fear for their subsistence in order to work. And there's now a growing body of evidence to suggest that whatever you think about that morally isn't in fact the case. And so building in a basic infrastructure at the bottom of the welfare state actually supports the public policies that exist at the moment, which are being undermined by the existence of chronic insecurity in society. And there you need to consider that, at least in the developed welfare states, there are a number of benefits that we already receive unconditionally, education and healthcare being a case in point, at least in Europe. And really, we ought to extend the argument for unconditionality to other areas of the welfare state. And so, moving on, I want to talk a little bit more about the applications of this argument. So I think there's quite a lot of evidence, if you go to the next slide, to support the case that I've made about the positive aspects of a UBI in terms of motivation. And on this slide, I just mentioned some of the publications that have come out in the last 10 years that evidence the impact of more stable sources of economic security on people's motivation and work behavior. And I don't need to go into it in detail, but one of them is a study I did I published in World Development, which was based on 2 surveys carried out in Brazil, which document the positive impacts of multiple sources of economic security. Next slide, please. Can we have then? Oh yeah, there we go. So here are some of the which I'll run through fairly quickly, and we can talk about this evidence if you want. But here's some of the evidence that has been built up over time to support the positive impacts that are being claimed for UBI. So here we see some of the evidence of the experiment I mentioned that was ongoing in Canada and which really wasn't studied at the time. And Evelyn Forget, who's a social scientist in Canada, dug up the evidence, and she found that there were some very significant positive health impacts of the unconditionality of income assistance and its stability at that time. And so one of them is that there was lower fertility rates for women who grew up with economic security. So actually women had less children and were more perhaps active in other spheres. And so economic security was a form of birth control in that sense. Next slide. In particular among very young women. And this is evidence of a lowering of the hospitalization rate, which declined by nearly 10% in the period of the experiment. And you also saw very major positive impacts on mental health. Next slide, please. And then you had, as I mentioned before, a number of micro models that looked at behavior and self-reported motivation of individuals, which, as I mentioned before, which testify to the revealed health impacts of economic security. Next slide, please. My own study was a study of the multivariate developmental sources of intrinsic work motivation. In other words, I tried to understand what would make people genuinely motivated to work rather than compelled to work. And it turned out that a combination of different sources of economic security, and I included longer levels, higher levels of schooling or more years of schooling in the concept of more economic security, because obviously more years of schooling is a sort of bargaining tool in the labor market. And this interacted with stability of employment and insurance status. Here, insurance status is a proxy for basic income. It is the existence, the knowledge of the existence of an external source of income security that is underlying your other sources of income that you might have. Next slide, please. And here you have some of the breakdown of the findings of that survey, which shows that personal development was much more likely to be valued by people who were insured and had experienced short unemployment in combined with high schooling. Next slide. And slight note of caution, I think, from this study, which is if you compared what the slum areas, I conducted 2 surveys in the city and in the slum, and I found that the effect of cash grants on motivation was weaker in the slums. And I think this highlights the importance of not thinking of universal basic income as a magic bullet, that actually you need other interventions, you need employment opportunities to be organized and incentivized in society alongside a universal basic income for maximum effect. And actually building the kind of infrastructure I'm talking about should help in that effort, but it isn't sufficient. Next slide, please. You also have evidence from experiments that have been conducted. The Indian experiments were mentioned at the beginning. The Madhya Pradesh unconditional cash transfer project was very interesting. It went on for 18 months, and it went on in a number of villages with both control groups and experiment groups. And so therefore you had quite a robust scientific framework for understanding the impact of unconditional and more stable income security. And I mean, here you see just a change in behavior amongst the poor. The poor spent more on nutritious food, on healthcare, and they borrowed less. So the problem of debt, which is a huge problem in Indian villages, was mitigated. It wasn't resolved, but it was mitigated. Children's schooling improved in 68% of the families. And there was a greater social inclusion of the disabled as well. It was also believed that lifting conditionalities helped to erode corruption, so that only 27% of income assistance in targeted schemes have been found to reach beneficiaries, whereas in the case of these, the unconditional payment of grants, the receipt is 100%. So all of the things that have sort of been argued for many decades have been evidenced in experiments. The next slide, I think, is very important. If you can go on to the next slide, it shows the impact on the health of young girls. And it shows the difference in weight distribution between males and females, which before the experiment, female physical development was stunted compared to boys. And after the experiment, females' physical development came on a par with boys. So this is a very significant finding. And I think the evidence suggests that families were able to spend more on all of their children and prioritize their health more equally. Next slide, please. Briefly, we should also note that there have been experiments in Europe. And what's very interesting in relation to what I said at the beginning, which is I think there's a global discourse emerging, is that these experiments show very similar things. They're not full basic income experiments. They focus on the poor, just as in the case of the Indian villages, and they focus on the unemployed in the case of Finland. But they do find reported lower levels of stress, and also they found an increased motivation to work. Although these experiments in Finland did not show higher labor market participation, there was a very small effect there. It also did not show lower labor market participation. And I think the more fine-grained examination of the results suggests that you would need a bit more time, and you would need to combine with other things in order to generate more positive employment effects. I mean, one of the problems in the Finnish survey was that people were still dependent on housing benefits, which were mean tested, and so were perhaps worried about taking on jobs if they were going to lose that housing benefit. So in fact, the experiment had some problems in the design. Next page, please. So in order to begin to round up my talk, really, I want to focus on what I think are some of the positive impacts on universal basic income potentially in the global South. And I think this centers on the building of state capacity, or form of state capacity that's based on trust rather than distrust. And there's been, both in the global North and global South, unintentional harm done, I think, by the increasingly targeted nature of anti-poverty policies, which create social distrust amongst those potentially entitled. And so what you, with a universal entitlement, you depoliticize entitlement, you avoid that the registration of poverty is used socially or politically. You actually avoid the spectrum of populism as well in anti-poverty policy, which sees anti-poverty policy measures come and go with the political cycle. You are able to build registers that are stable, whereas what you've seen in many cases is that although there are notional registers in a targeted anti-poverty scheme, there is no real incentive to keep the registers, and there's to build public capacity and administrative capacity, which I think a universal basic income would naturally enable. and you'd see greater continuity, therefore, in policy development. And here I just note that Nordic states built neutrality, information, and efficiency into their treatment of citizens and social policy through citizens registers. But of course, this does require capacity. So in a Nordic state, you will get a record from birth, and that that record is kept for purposes of benefits and tax and everything else. There's also an administrative efficiency benefit. It costs a lot to find the poorest and give them a small amount of money, and then move that money to someone else who might be more deserving next month, and so on. That's very costly, and in many ways it's a false economy, not least since the effect on beneficiaries of that uncertainty has been documented to be quite negative. And so you reduce exclusion errors, you reduce the need for repetition of visits, and the inevitable unfairness and inaccuracy that comes with visiting a poor family once a year and to discover what their varying incomes actually are, which is, really quite difficult to do fairly or accurately. And you generate a sense of effective citizenship. And so the picture here is of a lady who, in the case of Bolsa Familia in Brazil, who's showing the cards that through which she receives the cash. And really the idea here is that she doesn't have to negotiate with anyone. She doesn't have to negotiate with an official. She doesn't have to negotiate with her husband. She doesn't have to be seen by any villagers to go to sort of a particular anti-poverty social building. She has an entitlement that is neutral and stable, and therefore is a source of empowerment for her. But the last point, which I think is very important, which is part of my democratic case for basic income, is that I don't see basic income as sufficient, but I do see it as an enabler of other formalizations, which we know to be very, very important to increase the sharing of risk in society and enable social investment and greater levels of economic efficacy and coherence in public policy. So essentially formalizing the economy. And of course, basic income isn't the only tool, but with the creation of permanent registers, there's much greater scope to formalize the economy. With the fact that people can earn on top of the basic income, there's much greater scope for increasing or establishing new savings institutions, which also help formalize the economy and create shared risk. Next slide, please. And so the other point, or the last point in terms of the democratic case that I wanted to mention, is just the way in which, and the evidence we have of how citizens enjoying more stable economic security supports other policies. So in the United Kingdom, there's a lot of evidence and data that's been produced of the waste, if you might call it wasted public spending, in different policy areas that are meant to improve mental health or improve physical health, because people are not able to absorb the full benefits of this spending because of the insecurity in the labor market and an insecurity of entitlement. And you've seen a very significant reduction in the people who are entitled to benefits, who claim them in the United Kingdom and in other European states. And one of the reasons is that people are very unsure about how they're going to be treated. There's a growing use of sanctions in Europe, where there's more administrative capacity to exercise these sanctions. And the stigma and the mental health issues that come with that have been evidenced as a very significant disincentive and a source of ill health, deteriorating ill health and social exclusion. Next slide, please. And so, summing up, there's a number of contextual factors around the case for universal basic income that I've described, and there's now a policy window in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in a moment, I'm going to mention the global reports by international institutions that have come out in the last 3 months. But it's important to be aware that UBI has, in fact, been part of the welfare governance debate for a long time. As I mentioned, right from the 1970s and 80s, where you had experiments in the United States, in Nordic countries, in sabbatical grants to incentivize people to take on new careers. And then in the 1990s with the anti-poverty policies. And then you had the whole debate about the rise of precarious labor and new technology, which I haven't mentioned in a great deal of detail, partly because I don't think the new technology argument is very good, very convincing on its own. I don't think basic income, I don't think we're going to see an end of work, and I don't think basic income is enough to deal with the problem of new technology. And finally, in the last 10 years, and this has really pushed basic income to the forefront of the agenda in the global north, which I think has driven the interest really among policymakers globally as well, which is the rise of what I call a punitive state, a state that imposes sanctions systematically on the poor. And not only do many people think this is immoral, but it is also ineffective. In the UK, you see 1/3 of persons who leave sanctions to so-called unknown destinations, not into jobs, but into informality and insecurity. So informality and insecurity is now a global chronic phenomenon. So we have the evidence. The key is how we interpret that evidence and what we do with it. Next slide, please. So the recommendations is to really understand income security and the effective delivery of income security as a measure that is key in addressing growing health inequalities that have accompanied neoliberal globalization of the last 3 decades. We ought to see UBI as part of a basket of universal policies and services, and that can strengthen the coherence among those investments. And I therefore called UBI a pivoting reform in one article, just to sort of show how it is a strategic lever in the transformation of the modern welfare state, in the sense that it can help make policies work better together. And I suppose because I'm influenced by my work with the World Health Organization, one of the things that I argued there with a colleague in a report we published recently is that UBI talks to the concept of health in all policies. This is a concept that's been around for a while. And in a sense, UBI was really a missing piece in this health in all policies approach for the reasons that I've mentioned. And really, we ought to see income security as a core element of health policy. Next slide, please. So the problems now is, I think, the state of the debate. So UBI is not being taken up in the same way by different actors. There is, and we need to recognize that, very different interests at play, very different visions at play. There may not be in accordance with the visions I have. For example, I mean, my vision is for building public finance capacity to support UBI in common with increased investment in public services and development strategies, renewed development strategies. That may not be everyone's idea. And the other big problem is, of course, funding, as distinct from finance for UBI. Now, finance is something you find for the short term, such as during coronavirus. Funding is something you build up that's reliable for the long term. And that's a very different challenge. In the global north, you have austerity, which, how do you get around that? And in the global south, you have weak fiscal capacity. Now, next slide. So it is in this context that you need to examine critically, I think, the new reports that have come out on UBI by the global development organizations. And well, this is very interesting. On a positive note, the global development institutions begin to take a positive view of UBI after about 2017. I use that date because that's the date when the IMF publishes a positive report of UBI, especially as an anti-poverty measure in the global south. But the IMF is more cautious about UBI in the global north, which is interesting because global north is better able to afford it. We can discuss why. The World Health Organization, I produced a report for them with a colleague with the European office. And we talk about the effectiveness of health in all policies, a slightly different approach, which is about building up the universal welfare state. The World Bank, just a couple of months ago, published a really very insightful report also, but it's about the global south and whether the global south countries can afford a UBI and the trade-offs involved. And it's a very sober report because in that report, what the World Bank is saying is that it will hurt a UBI will hurt the poor. If you take a straightforward switch from what you've got now into a UBI tomorrow, that will hurt the extreme poor. And that's obvious, because with the same pot of resources, if you stretch that out and give it to everyone, you will hurt the poor. So, what I'm arguing in a short publication that's coming out of the UNDP in a couple of days is that it's actually wrong to see UBI as a redistributive policy. That's not the role of UBI. The role of UBI is not to redistribute from rich to poor. That's the role of tax policies. The role of UBI is to enable citizenship and security in society and the economy. And so what does that mean? That means that you have to plan for UBI, and you have to move in steps, because the World Bank is, of course, right. You can't, with the same amount of money, move from anti-poverty policy to UBI tomorrow. And so that's a sobering reflection. And last is the UNDP's report on temporary basic income. And that reflects the argument and enthusiasm that has been, I think, rising in the last year about the prospect that the COVID pandemic might finally bring UBI to the forefront. Now, I've been skeptical about this from the beginning, the concept of temporary UBIs, because I don't think the funding, the level that you would need to insure people effectively could be sustained fiscally over time. So you're having two different debates. So I'm not against temporary UBIs, but I'm worried about the argument that you can go straight from temporary UBIs to permanent UBI because you couldn't afford it. So whilst this has helped ignite a debate about the need for UBI, what I think it really does is highlight a debate about the need to plan for UBI, and whether we should have TPIs is a slightly different, whether we, instead of furlough schemes, we should also give more cash to people regardless of sustaining their jobs is another and very important argument. And so briefly, the last couple of slides. So here I just wanted to show the difference in capacity, what I call public finance for human development. These slides are from my book. And you see there public, on one axis, a public revenue level and integration. So that's a composite index. It's quite complicated, but essentially reveals what I call funding capacity, not finance capacity, but funding capacity, sustainable, inclusive tax systems. And on the one side, and the other side, levels of public spending on human development, which is a weighted index that favors public spending on items like education and training and care and other aspects of human development, and social spending as well. And what you see there, obviously, there's a correlation. I mean, you would expect that between public revenue level and integration and public spending on human development. If you go to the next slide, so this is 2000. If you go to the next slide, you come to 2010. And what you see there is there's a slightly reduced level of public revenue level and integration, but you have actually a racketing up of spending on human development in many countries. So what does that show? It shows an increasingly constrained scenario, whereby whereas some countries have built capacity, and actually a number of global South countries have built capacity, but from a very low level, you also have increasing need, which is reflected in pressures on states to spend. So without increasing public finance capacity considerably in the global South and North, we really can't be looking at UBI, or we will be looking at UBI as a trade-off for other important investments. And so for me, the bigger picture is one of a need to focus on increasing public finance capacity. Next slide is very briefly reasons of support for basic income in Britain. There was a survey done, and it shows the confusion around support for UBI. If you look at the red tick, the 19% towards the upper left of the data, that is 19% of respondents thinking that the current system is working. So you can see that people don't think the welfare state is working. But they also, if you go down, are confused about UBI. There's 49% think that UBI would help reduce stigma. But just underneath there, they also think it's unaffordable. They think that targeting the poor is better. Not the majority, but a significant minority. So you have increasing support, but also a bit of confusion. Next slide, the key takeaway messages. There is political support for UBI. There's growing political support for UBI in mature welfare states. As I just showed you, very few people think that the current system of income security works well. Okay, it's the lowest score on the table. And we have now a policy window. We know that the contemporary design undermines the effectiveness of health interventions. We know that the relationship between health providers and individuals, for example, who have to prove that they are not well in order to get income, we know that relationship is compromised. And we know that a stable economic security architecture can abate stresses of the economy, is compromise health and health policy. Sorry, there's a slight typo on that slide. So last slide, conclusion. I think there's a lot of evidence, not least the fact that global development institutions are now on board to suggest that UBI is part of building a vision of how to construct coherence in development policy. So you don't have economic policy or market expansion on the one hand, and compensatory pro-poor policy on the other hand, which actually don't work together. And I just want to conclude with a brief reflection on UBI and the Millennium Development Goals. So I haven't listed the Millennium Development Goals, but and the Sustainable Development Goals that replace them. So the Millennium Development Goals had slightly more modest ambitions. States take, for example, education to increase the level of enrollment in primary education. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the goals we're aiming for now, they have a much higher level of ambition. So take, for example, just education, lifelong education, and equal high quality of education for all. Now, how are you going to do that if people do not have the economic security to take up education, and whether public or private, and so publicly or privately provided? So there really is a disjuncture between the economic security system and the Sustainable Development Goals. And the fact is that the health benefits of economic security still are not well understood by governments or societies. That global development institutions are coming on board, but governments are not coming on board. And that's a fact. Society is still very skeptical about UBI because it's unconditional. And the health sector is not present in the economic security reform debate or experiments. So the experiments that are being conducted by well-meaning individuals or by economic departments, economic policy departments, but not the health departments. And so that shows you that we're still a long way to go in terms of governments taking this on board. And yet the evidence, as I said, speaks for itself. The economic system needs a safety valve. People who are stressed cannot invest in health. We have a pandemic of mental ill health across the world. Universalism in this context is a chance to build infrastructure ground up to incorporate society, and it's the only way to do it. But at the same time, the full benefits of stable and unconditional economic security depends on other active policies. So we are at the watershed moment, and the debate of UBI is at the center. Thank you.
Dr. Abla, I need to unmute.
Okay. Yes. All right. Thank you very much, Louise, for a very interesting presentation, very elaborate. Let me start by asking our audience, please, to stay with us for the next 15 minutes, so that there is room for discussion where our time is up. But given the importance of the topic, I'm sure you are going to continue to stay with us. In the presentation, you really made a very strong case for the universal basic income. You criticize the conditional cash transfers and how they were never applied in the right way, and they had actually a lot more negative even than positive impact, and this is what brought along the universal basic income in order to have the design for income security. You made the case. I think you need to write another book about my main question. I have two questions for you. One of them is a tough one, the other one is less tough, but both I think require that you write another book. Okay, and the other book should be about the funding. As an economist, all those advantages are super and great and everything, all right? But in order to have funding and not finance, in order to have something that is permanent, okay, how can it be done? What would be the sources for that? If it's not going to be the taxes, then how is it going to be? Who's going to contribute for it? Is it going to be the private sector? Is it going to be the government? This is a very big issue. You touched upon it at the very, at the very end, when actually I would have loved to see this, okay, for many slides, presenting specifically the experience of the countries that actually try to implement, okay? Some countries try to go for it and they would immediately find problems with the funding and also with specification of what would be the level of income, how would it be distributed, etc., etc. The advantages are obvious: to have people more motivated, to have people healthier, to have them appreciate their citizenship, not shame them by having to run and say that they are poor, etc. The advantages are obvious, okay? But then, unfortunately, it's all about how you can fund such a thing in a way that makes it sustainable, and therefore its positive impact also sustainable. This is my main question for you. My second question for you is whether the interest in universal basic income is going to continue as we proceed to 2021, okay, now that we're starting to have a vaccine. You did mention that this topic always emerges during times of crisis. As important and as utopian as it is, during crisis it comes and then it subsides. Is it going to subside, okay, when the vaccine is there and when things start to get normal? Back to the older question, because of its importance, countries are coming out of COVID-19 in a very bad shape. The economy is not doing well. Businesses are not going to do well, all right? So how do you go about it? How do you go about it in a staged way? But before you answer, I want to see if we have any specific questions from the audience, okay? I had a couple of questions on my phone, actually, not on the list, and everything is rotating around the funding issue. So please, in just a few minutes, please, because we're having time issues now, and we don't want to lose our audience. So please, within a few minutes, try to answer these two questions. Thank you. And it would be great if you can tell us what would be the size usually for any particular country. How big is the income? It's measured relative to the poverty line. How far up from the poverty line is it? A bit more on that, please.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do you want me to answer now? I thought you were scouting for more questions.
No, actually, everything is rotating around the same issue. Okay,
right.
Which one at the very last few minutes of the 45-minute presentation, please. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think it's two things. I think it's very interesting that we are now just talking about the funding and not the thing, because, in the last 30 years and still, the issue is it the right thing to do? Now, when you're saying it's wonderful, it's a great idea, well, you ask people 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they would say it was not a good idea because people would be lazy, people don't deserve it, we don't need it, etc., etc., etc. So, we've had to really deal with those sorts of arguments and present that kind of evidence. But as I said at the end of my talk, it really is foolhardy to think you can just implement a basic income just like that, because and I'm not an advocate. I'm as much a realist as you are, and but I also think that if we look at the real big structural changes in history, they have come about on the back of political will. They have come back, you've had a goal, you've had some examples, you've had a goal, and then you've had a political will to implement it. And then you find, or you organize, or you plan for the funding, right? And you plan for the institutional changes. Now, before talking about what that might mean, at the very minimal, and that is where the debate is now in Europe, at the very minimal, you can start by thinking about the infrastructure and say to yourself, this is an infrastructure that is important. We're not going to say in the UK or Denmark or Finland, we're not going to aim to have a level of basic income that will be sufficient. We're going to aim to begin to change the existing systems and integrate them in a way that there is a level at the bottom that is unconditional and universal. And that can be afforded. There's been quite a lot of studies done with tax neutrality or very small increases in tax. So that is feasible. But then, of course, the trade-off is that universal basic income will not be enough on its own. However, there are many people, and myself among them, who think that it would still be a hugely significant change. At the moment, people, as I just said, are not taking up benefits they're entitled to. At the moment, people are, the society is becoming informal. And so, you know, there's a shift in direction in terms of citizen status and entitlements that I think is absolutely hugely significant. In terms of, you know, how you're going to raise, what sort of levels of tax are you going to need to raise? Well, there is a problem of tax anyway in the global south. You know, global south tax rates just aren't high enough. And if you look at the fiscal monitor, the IMF's fiscal monitor of October 2017, the IMF says that. The IMF says you need to raise a level of tax. You need to raise the level of tax on the rich in particular. The World Bank report is showing in detail, the World Bank report of UBI, reveals in detail the absolutely atrocious inequalities in the tax system in the global south. But I will be the first to say that without addressing those bigger structural things, the idea of UBI remains a global ambition dependent on global finance and institutional philanthropy, and cannot be politically realized. We are only at the beginning of a debate about reshaping the public sector globally and bringing the public sector back. Not forget, last 30 years, 40 years, has been an onslaught on the public sector.
Right.
But in my book, I've reproduced one of the calculations, but there are many. One of the calculations for the UK, which shows, which works with a level of £61 a week, which mimics the benefit level currently in Britain, but it rolls in the conversion of the free tax allowance into the funding of the scheme. So it uses existing funds, but converts their use. So we say it's not about the money, it's about how it's given. So there's actually quite a lot of money in the system now, if you look at the mature welfare states, that can be repurposed and given in a different form. But of course, that is different for every country. But you know, I think no one aims today at a very high level. We think of starting low and building.
I think all the research at this point needs to focus not anymore on providing evidence for its importance, because it is, okay, but rather focus on funding and how it takes place. This issue is going to become even more serious in the future with the technology and the digitalization, people losing jobs. There will be people who cannot find jobs, not because they do not want to work, because there aren't jobs that are suitable for their skills. So the need for it is actually huge. And I think it needs to start with countries performing properly, doing the proper reforms in their economies, institutional, structural, everything, so that the economy starts to operate right. But there is a lot more to it than that, okay? And I think this is worth another discussion, Ali.
It is another discussion, but if you're talking about the transition, I think for me, the first step in the transition is to make what you have now more unconditional, so the administration is improved and address some of those.
That's a very positive point. I think it's a great point to end with. Make whatever it is that you're offering with better conditions, unconditional, or actually much, much better conditions than what exists right now. I think this is a proper starting point, plus fixing the problems in the economy and remembering that the poor are going to continue to be poor after the crisis. We've had the problem before COVID. It will continue to exist unless we actually face it in a proper stage way. Thank you very much, Louise, for a very, very interesting and challenging presentation. Until we need to have another session where we talk about the funding, and maybe by that time, ECS would have done actually work on the Egyptian experience in that. Before finishing, I need to announce that next week there's going to be the last webinar for the fall, and the speaker is going to be Catherine Valvoda Smith, the Executive Director of the Center for Corporate Citizenship, Boston College Carroll School of Management, and she will talk about corporate citizenship for the 21st century. This is going to be the last webinar of the season, and I'm sure it's going to be the last webinar of the year. I'm sure we're all very happy that 2020 is going to end, and we are hoping and praying and wishing that 2021 is going to be a better year, and maybe then we are going to have a new social ecosystem, the one that we're dreaming of, where UBI is at the heart of it. Thank you all, and it's a very early Happy New Year, but since I'll be seeing you in whatever other webinars probably next year, good luck to all of you, and God bless you all. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.